For thousands of years, millions of people survived on a tiny African grain that modern agriculture almost erased from history. It grew without chemicals, resisted drought, and fed entire civilizations. But when industrial food systems arrived, this crop became a problem, so it disappeared. Not by accident, but by design. Long before supermarkets, fertilizers, and global supply chains existed, African communities depended on a grain most of the world has never heard of, fonio. It was not a luxury food or a rare delicacy. It was survival. Easy to grow, fast to harvest, and adaptable to harsh climates, fonio sustained villages where other crops failed. Yet today, it is almost absent from global agriculture. Fonio's power was not just cultural, it was practical. Unlike wheat or corn, it required minimal water, no synthetic fertilizers, and no large-scale machinery. Farmers could grow it on poor soil, on rocky land, and during unpredictable seasons. In regions where drought meant famine, fonio meant continuity. It was agriculture designed for resilience, not profit. But resilience does not fit well into industrial systems. Modern agriculture is built on uniformity, standardized seeds, predictable yields, massive monocultures, and dependence on chemical inputs. Fonio did not fit this model. It was too local, too diverse, too independent. And crops that cannot be controlled, patented, or industrialized rarely survive in a global market. During the colonial period, European powers reshaped African agriculture. Traditional crops like fonio were gradually replaced by wheat, rice, and maize, crops better suited to global trade and colonial economies. Local knowledge was labeled primitive, while imported crops were promoted as modern and superior. Over time, fonio was pushed aside, not because it failed, but because it did not serve the new system. The disappearance of fonio was not dramatic. There were no bans, no laws, no official declarations. It faded quietly. Schools stopped teaching it. Governments stopped supporting it. Markets stopped buying it. Farmers were encouraged to grow crops that could be exported, processed, and taxed. Fonio survived only in remote communities, kept alive by tradition rather than policy. Ironically, everything that made fonio undesirable to industrial agriculture is exactly what makes it valuable today. It grows fast, tolerates extreme climates, and requires almost no external inputs. In a world facing climate change, soil degradation, and rising food insecurity, fonio represents a forgotten model of sustainability. Yet it remains marginal, overshadowed by global commodities. When researchers recently rediscovered fonio, they were surprised by its nutritional profile. Rich in essential amino acids, minerals, and fiber, it outperformed many modern grains. Suddenly, chefs, scientists, and health markets became interested. But by then, global agriculture had already chosen its winners. Fonio was not part of the industrial script. The question is not whether fonio was good enough. The question is whether it was profitable enough for a system built on scale, control, and dependency. Crops like fonio challenge the logic of industrial food. They empower local farmers instead of corporations, resilience instead of uniformity, survival instead of efficiency. And systems rarely tolerate what they cannot dominate. Fonio did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it did not belong to the future imagined by modern agriculture. Yet, as climate instability grows and food systems become fragile, the return of fonio is not just a curiosity, it is a warning. Sometimes the crops we abandon are the ones that could have saved us. For most of the 20th century, global agriculture followed a single direction: scale. Governments invested in crops that could be standardized, mechanized, and traded internationally. Wheat, corn, and rice became pillars of the global diet. Crops that could not be easily industrialized were sidelined. Fonio, with its small grains and traditional harvesting methods, did not fit the logic of machines and global markets. In many African regions, farmers were encouraged to abandon traditional crops and adopt imported seeds. These new crops promised higher yields, but they also required fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation systems. Over time, communities became dependent on external inputs and global prices. Fonio, once a symbol of autonomy, was replaced by crops that tied local farmers to international supply chains and economic vulnerability. The shift was not only economic, but psychological. Traditional crops began to be associated with poverty and backwardness, while imported foods represented progress and modernity. Fonio slowly lost its prestige. Younger generations stopped learning how to cultivate it. What had once been a foundation of survival became a forgotten relic of a past that modern societies were taught to leave behind. Yet, in the shadows of global agriculture, Fonio never truly disappeared. In remote villages, elderly farmers continued to plant it, harvest it, and cook it. Not because it was fashionable, but because it worked. When drought destroyed other crops, Fonio survived. When soils degraded, Fonio adapted. It remained a quiet insurance policy against hunger, preserved not by institutions but by memory and necessity. As climate change intensified, scientists began to look again at forgotten crops. They searched for plants capable of surviving extreme conditions without heavy chemical inputs. Slowly, Fonio returned to academic papers and research centers. What was once dismissed as primitive suddenly appeared innovative. But rediscovery does not guarantee reintegration. Global food systems rarely change direction once they are established. Industrial agriculture thrives on predictability. Crops must mature at the same time, respond uniformly to fertilizers, and fit into automated processes. Fonio, however, evolved in diverse ecosystems and adapted to local variations. Its strength was diversity, not uniformity. Ironically, the very qualities that made Fonio resilient were the same qualities that made it inconvenient for an industry obsessed with control and efficiency. Beyond agriculture, Fonio also carried cultural meaning. It was present in rituals, celebrations, and everyday meals. It connected generations through shared practices and knowledge. When Fonio declined, something more than a crop was lost. Entire systems of knowledge, techniques, and identities were weakened. The disappearance of Fonio was not just agricultural, it was civilizational. Today, global food security depends heavily on a few dominant crops. This concentration creates fragility. Diseases, climate events, or geopolitical crises can disrupt entire supply chains. Fonio represents an alternative logic, many small, resilient crops instead of a few dominant ones. Yet global markets continue to prioritize efficiency over resilience, repeating the same pattern that once pushed Fonio to the margins. When Fonio reappears in Western markets, it is often marketed as an exotic superfood. Packaged, branded, and sold at high prices, it becomes a product for niche consumers. But this version of Fonio is disconnected from its original purpose. It is no longer a tool of survival, but a commodity. The system that once ignored Fonio now reinvents it, but only in forms it can control. This transformation reveals a deeper contradiction. Crops like Fonio are tolerated only when they can be integrated into industrial logic. When they exist outside that logic, they are ignored. When they threaten it, they are marginalized. Fonio's story is not unique. It is a pattern repeated across continents, where local resilience is sacrificed in favor of global uniformity and economic convenience. If Fonio had become a global staple, the structure of modern agriculture might look very different today. Its low dependency on chemicals and machinery would reduce the dominance of multinational corporations that control seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. A crop that empowers local farmers instead of industrial systems is not easily scalable, not easily controllable, and not easily monetized. In global markets, that is not an advantage. The rise of industrial agriculture did not simply replace traditional crops. It reshaped the meaning of food itself. Productivity became more important than resilience, uniformity more important than diversity, and profit more important than sustainability. Fonio represented an older logic, where survival was the priority and ecosystems mattered. As the world embraced industrial efficiency, crops like Fonio became invisible in policy, research, and trade. In the United States and other Western countries, agricultural success is measured in tons, exports, and market share. Fonio does not produce massive yields per hectare compared to industrial grains, but it produces something else: stability. It grows when others fail. It feeds when others collapse. Yet stability is difficult to quantify in economic models that reward speed and volume rather than long-term resilience. For Afro-American communities, crops of African origin were more than food, they were memory. Enslaved Africans carried seeds, techniques, and agricultural knowledge across the Atlantic. Some of these traditions survived in hidden forms, adapted to new lands and harsh conditions. But over generations, many African crops were replaced by industrial ones. Fonio was among those that did not survive the transition into modern Western agriculture. The disappearance of Fonio was not a single event, but a slow erosion. Each decade, fewer farmers planted it. Each generation, fewer people knew how to process it. Each policy decision favored crops that aligned with global trade. By the time scientists and chefs rediscovered Fonio, its presence had already been reduced to fragments of tradition scattered across rural Africa and diaspora communities. When global institutions talk about solving hunger, they rarely mention crops like Fonio. Solutions usually involve expanding industrial agriculture, improving supply chains, or developing genetically modified seeds. These approaches assume that food security must come from centralized systems. Fonio challenges this assumption. It suggests that decentralized, local, and culturally rooted crops can be just as powerful, if not more resilient. But decentralized crops are difficult to standardize. They resist patents, global branding, and large-scale monocultures. For corporations, such crops represent unpredictability rather than opportunity. Fonio cannot easily be turned into a global commodity without losing its essence. And systems built on control rarely embrace what they cannot fully dominate. So Fonio remained outside the spotlight, quietly feeding those who still remembered it. In recent years, climate crises have exposed the fragility of modern food systems. Droughts, floods, and supply disruptions have shown that dependence on a few global crops is risky. Suddenly, researchers began searching for resilient alternatives. Fonio appeared again, not as folklore, but as a strategic resource. Yet reintegrating it into global agriculture would require challenging deeply entrenched economic and political interests. The story of Fonio forces an uncomfortable question. What if modern agriculture did not forget these crops by accident? What if it systematically favored plants that could be controlled, traded, and optimized for profit? Fonio was never inefficient. It was simply incompatible with an industry built on dependency. Its disappearance was not dramatic enough to be remembered, but not random enough to be meaningless. Today, Fonio stands at a crossroads. It can remain a niche product, marketed as an exotic superfood for wealthy consumers, or it can be reclaimed as what it always was, a foundation of resilient food systems. But embracing Fonio fully would require more than culinary trends. It would require questioning the very logic of industrial agriculture and redefining what progress in food truly means. In many ways, Fonio exposes a paradox at the heart of modern progress. The more advanced agriculture becomes, the more dependent it grows on fragile systems, global logistics, chemical inputs, and centralized production. Fonio represents the opposite logic. It thrives in simplicity, decentralization, and adaptation. Its existence challenges the assumption that technological complexity is always superior to ecological intelligence. For centuries, African farmers developed agricultural systems based on observation rather than industrial formulas. They selected crops that could survive uncertainty, not just maximize yield. Fonio was part of this logic. It was never designed to dominate markets. It was designed to endure reality. When industrial agriculture arrived, this philosophy was replaced by a model that valued efficiency over survival and scale over stability. The global food industry often presents itself as the solution to hunger. Yet its structure creates dependencies that traditional crops never required. Farmers become buyers of seeds, chemicals, and machines. Communities become vulnerable to price fluctuations and supply disruptions. Fonio required none of this. It functioned outside the industrial loop, which made it resilient. but also economically inconvenient for systems built on continuous consumption. In academic circles, Fonio is now studied as a climate-smart crop. Reports highlight its resistance to drought, its adaptability to poor soils, and its nutritional value. But research alone does not change reality. Policies, investments, and markets still prioritize industrial crops. Fonio is admired in theory and ignored in practice, celebrated in conferences but absent from large-scale agricultural strategies. Meanwhile, millions of farmers around the world face increasingly unpredictable climates. Crops fail, soils degrade, and water becomes scarce. In this context, Fonio appears less like an ancient curiosity and more like a blueprint for survival. Yet adopting it would require shifting power away from centralized agribusiness toward local communities. Such shifts rarely happen without resistance from established economic interests. The story of Fonio also reveals how history is written. Crops that align with dominant economic systems are documented, researched, and celebrated. Crops that do not fit are forgotten. Over time, absence becomes normality. The disappearance of Fonio was not recorded as a loss, because losses that do not affect global markets rarely enter official narratives. Silence became the most effective form of erasure. When consumers in wealthy countries encounter Fonio today, they often see it as novelty rather than necessity. But for centuries, it was the opposite. It was not a trend, but a lifeline. This shift in perception reflects a deeper imbalance. Foods that sustain vulnerable populations are undervalued, while foods that generate profit are glorified. Fonio's marginalization is therefore not accidental, but structural. If Fonio were widely adopted today, it would not replace industrial crops overnight. But it would disrupt the logic that governs food production. It would prove that resilience can rival efficiency, that local systems can coexist with global ones, and that agriculture does not have to be synonymous with dependency. For industries built on control and scale, even small disruptions can represent uncomfortable questions. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Fonio's story is not that it disappeared, but that it survived without recognition. While industrial agriculture expanded, Fonio quietly continued feeding communities ignored by global markets. Its persistence suggests that alternatives to dominant systems have always existed. They were simply excluded from the spotlight. Fonio was not destroyed. It was sidelined until the world forgot to look for it. As the 21st century advances, humanity faces a choice. Continue reinforcing fragile, centralized food systems, or rediscover decentralized models rooted in resilience. Fonio symbolizes this crossroads. It is not just a grain, but a question. What kind of future do we want to cultivate? The answer may depend less on technology and more on whether we are willing to reconsider the crops we once left behind. For decades, the disappearance of crops like Fonio was treated as an inevitable consequence of modernization. But inevitability is often just a convenient narrative. Choices were made, policies were designed, investments were directed. Some crops were promoted, others were neglected. Fonio did not vanish naturally. It was gradually excluded from the structures that define what the world grows, trades, and eats. The food industry rarely eliminates crops directly. Instead, it creates conditions where only certain plants can survive economically. Subsidies, research funding, infrastructure, and global trade agreements favor standardized grains. In this environment, crops like Fonio are not banned. They are simply unsupported. Over time, lack of support becomes lack of presence, and absence becomes proof that they were never important. Yet history tells a different story. Long before industrial agriculture existed, Fonio sustained complex societies. It fed communities through droughts, wars, and environmental uncertainty. It was not marginal, it was central. The fact that it disappeared from global awareness says less about its value and more about the priorities of modern systems. Sometimes what disappears is not what fails, but what does not serve power. If Fonio had been integrated into global agriculture instead of being sidelined, the world might have developed a more diversified and resilient food system. But diversification is inefficient for monopolies. Uniform crops are easier to control, predict, and profit from. Fonio represented diversity, autonomy, and local adaptation. In an industry that thrives on uniformity, those qualities were not assets, they were obstacles. Today, as climate crises intensify and food insecurity spreads, the logic that once marginalized Fonio begins to look dangerously short-sighted. The world searches for solutions in laboratories, algorithms, and engineered seeds, while ignoring plants that already solved many of these problems centuries ago. Fonio is not a futuristic innovation. It is a reminder that the past often holds answers the present refuse to see. The return of Fonio is therefore not just agricultural, it is political. It questions who decides what the world eats. It challenges the dominance of industrial crops and the narratives that justify them. Every time Fonio is planted, it represents a small act of resistance against a system that prefers dependence over autonomy. Its revival is not merely culinary, it is ideological. But reviving forgotten crops is not easy. It requires rebuilding knowledge, restoring cultural pride, and reshaping economic incentives. It demands that societies value resilience as much as efficiency, diversity as much as scale, and local knowledge as much as industrial expertise. Fonio's story shows that food is never just food. It is power, history, identity, and the architecture of survival. Fonio was not erased because it was weak. It was erased because it was independent. It did not require the systems that dominate modern agriculture, and therefore it could not be fully absorbed by them. In a world where control often matters more than sustainability, crops like Fonio become inconvenient truths. Their disappearance is not a mystery, but a consequence of how modern food systems were designed. Today, Fonio stands as both a warning and an opportunity, a warning that progress can erase valuable knowledge, and an opportunity to rethink how humanity feeds itself. The question is no longer whether Fonio deserved to survive. The question is whether modern agriculture can survive without rediscovering crops like it. Sometimes the future of food depends on what the past tried to preserve.